Good evening, everyone. There's something about this room that always makes me a wee bit nervous when I stand up to speak in it, I must say. And I'd kind of prefer to be up in that chair up there, to be quite honest. I'm a wee bit disappointed. But welcome, everyone. I wanted to just take a talk through. As I say, the nerves also made me yearn for the days where I just said I'd give a talk on epilepsy or anti-epileptic drugs, but I've now been hoisted by my own petard here, and I've got a talk on something. Maureen said other strings to my bow, more to tell you all the things, all the failures I've had, and all the disasters I've had, and talk you through them and how it's gone. So this is going to be the outline for the talk. I'm going to give some anecdotes and then a few more anecdotes and then a couple of anecdotes. And there is a serious risk that I will be dropping some names and some stories. I have checked with the people that I'm going to name check, and they've said it's okay, so that's fine. But any complaints, there may well be a bit of video later on depending on how things go. Finishing off, now a wee touch of neuroscience, and followed right at the end by a question of what are you doing here? What should you be expecting from your time at university, and what should the university be expecting from you now and in the future? So let me take you back way before many of you were born. And this kind of all started with this guy here in this photograph. This is a guy called Mike McKirdy, who's a surgeon over in the RAH in Paisley. But back in January 1985, he was president of the MedShare, the Medical Student Society. And Mike had decided it would be a great idea to get the medical school review going. So he set out a 20-minute slot for each individual year, and each year was charged with presenting a 20-minute worth of skit and song. And I found myself down in the debating hall in the Union, jammed to the rafters. Never been on stage ever at any time before. And I was charged with introducing, being a sort of MC for the fourth year sketch. And as I stood there, and the place was heaving, and there was chaos abounding. I'll not name any names, but there was chaos abounding. And I have to say, as I stood there and went through what was fairly lame material, and people actually laughed, and I thought, hold on a wee second here, this is great fun. And I did really enjoy it, and I thought, well, I didn't think that was me, but it kind of is me. And then, of course, things moved on in successive years. And of course, as you move through medical school, you have your halfway ball and your graduation ball. And I spoke at those, and I kind of quite enjoyed that. And then when you leave university, and people were getting hitched, and there was weddings, and there was christenings, and there was other ceremonies, and there was another excuse to stand up and show off in front of people. And I kind of quite enjoyed it, and it was all good fun. And this went on for a few years, and I worked my way through as a junior doctor, having graduated in '86. And a couple of years as a junior doctor, oh, you're the guy that likes to stand up and show, heard what you did, spoke at so-and-so's wedding, and I thought, oh yeah, it was good fun. And at that point, the alternative comedy scene was beginning to open up, first of all in London, and then up in Glasgow. So in April 1990, and a Saturday in April 1990, which is actually more famous for the poll tax riots in London, the first fissures began to show in the whole Thatcherite edifice. And on that night, completely unrelated, I promise, I took to the stage for the first time in a proper comedy gig. And my material, lame as it was, had been sieved, rewritten, redrafted, the bad bits taken out, other better bits put in by two friends of mine, Dave Rayside and Dave Stewart. And as I headed off to do my 10-minute open spot just before the interval, and I remember the rest of the bill quite clearly, but I remember that 10 minutes, and it was great fun. And I sat down, and by the end of the night, I'd been offered another gig 3 weeks later. And guess what? Someone was going to give me 10 quid. Now, if the Inland Revenue HMRC are listening, I'm sorry I didn't declare it, but I've hopefully made up for it in times gone since. So about that time, people began to say, oh, you did weddings, oh yeah, you've done a few open spots at the thing. Yeah, that was quite good fun, and that was nice, and it felt okay. And shortly after that, I got offered a slot to do a research job. Now, in those days, you had to do a spell in research before you could progress in hospital medicine. And I was approached by one of the professors at West Infirmary, Martin Brodie. He said, listen, I know you're looking for a research job. I can't find anybody else. Would you like to do this? And at that point, I had a young family, and this quote has come back to haunt me on a number of occasions. I said, listen, I'm a busy man. I've got 2 young kids. I'm not taking time out of a busy clinical job to do research, not for any length of time, but I'll tell you what, I'll give you 18 months, and then after that I'll be finished. He said, well, I've got a great project looking at drug X and its effect on epilepsy in the over 65s. That sounds fine by me. I can get back in and do some proper clinical work, I said. So I set off to work in the epilepsy unit in the Western Infirmary, and of course, as always happens, and of course you have to realise this will happen at many different stages in your career, within a month of starting, the trial was off. There had been other studies showing that in actual fact, this drug in the elderly was hopeless. It should never be tried. So the idea of having a randomised clinical trial in elderly patients with epilepsy just folded. So I'd left this clinical job in the department in medicine in the Western. I was sitting there a month in with no study waiting to be done. Now, there was a young postdoctoral researcher there, Graham Sills, and some of you may know Graham. And Graham and I began to do some work together, and he said, well, why don't you come and help us in the labs? Now, you wouldn't want me to put a shelf up, barely make toast, I have to say. But the thought of having me in the lab at least gave some more exercise from a comedy potential, as Graham and the other assistants in the lab had a right good laugh at my total ineptitude at test tubes and anything complex at all. But actually, things began to take shape. And from having a single study that was guaranteed 18 months' work and some papers on, by the way, you'll get your MD thesis, slowly but surely we began to build something from it. And that was, as I say, down to Graham's energy and his vision. And I was kind of dragged along behind it. And this is a theme that you'll see quite a lot in the time. So Graham and I spent the next few years going through these studies and looking at basic neurochemistry of anti-epileptic drug action and some preclinical studies and a few clinical studies as well. As I say, usually with his compass for what was right and what was appropriate in mind for the stupid joke and the big idea. Now, during this time, of course, the time as an open spot down at Blackfriars and Bell Street had carried on, and I began to get some more gigs. And, you know, the terrible nights, the ones where everyone was really quiet, became less frequent, and the ones where it had gone okay and had gone from doing the bit just before the interval, which is the easy bit in a comedy gig, to all of a sudden start to do the opening and then sometimes the bit after the interval. Not quite a headline stage, but I was beginning to move on, and this is where I began to come across other people and meet some people. Some of you might recognise Eddie Izzard when he was still doing gigs all in English. And, you know, Eddie and I was doing a gig in Dublin at the time. I was over for a conference, took the night off, went to do a gig, and this comedian, who someone had met in the Edinburgh Festival, stopped in at the Comedy Cellar to do a few minutes. Well, 55 and a half minutes later, Eddie Izzard walked off, and the rest of us were dead in the water. And that was yet another example of things going a wee bit quiet. But, you know, managed to win things back just, although my accent was kind of impenetrable. And other names began, some of you might remember Ed Byrne, a young student in Strathclyde University, and he started a comedy gig down at 13th Note, and some of us took this over and began to book individuals and did a tour of Scotland with Alan Davis. Johnny Vegas, we gave him his first gig in Glasgow, which is a story in itself we'll maybe come to. Frankie Boyle was just starting in the mid-1990s, of course has gone on to huge heights as misanthropic left-wing firebrand. Alex Kapranos, he wasn't big on the comedy, big on the sound, on the sound technician. He used to do the sound for the 13th Note. One of these surreal things about 2 years ago when I woke up and my email inbox was full of people saying, hey, do you realise you're the subject of a Twitter conversation between Ed Byrne and Alex Kapranos of Franz Ferdinand? And I had no idea. I couldn't remember who Alex Kapranos was at the time, but then reminded and came back. So things were, I have to say, kind of smug. I had a newspaper column once or twice a week in the Herald, a radio show looking at football, and as I say, the quiet nights in the gigs have got less, the moving up the profile and the gigs have got a bit more, and I'd begun to look further afield for gigs. So as well as a wee couple of gigs in the Edinburgh Festival and as well as a wee gig here and there in Scotland, I'd begun to go to Liverpool and Manchester and a couple of gigs down in the Comedy Store. Now, the Comedy Store is very much head office when it comes to comedy in the UK. It was the very first proper comedy gig over here. And the import of the comedy scene from America, and Robin Williams came over and played the first night, and then Ben Elton and all the group who made Channel 4 and the Footlights crew then began to play Comedy Store. So Comedy Store, even by the mid-90s, was very much head office. And I'd played there a few times, and my first ever Saturday night booking in the Comedy Store, I was feeling kind of good about myself. This was a Saturday night, this was the big smoke, this was head office, and I was here for, as you might imagine, the easy pickings group, the easy picking slot, which was the bit just before the interval. Well, I took my place, and do you know that bit in films where someone's going to give a speech and they get a bit quiet and then you can hear their mouth open like this, and then you always get a bit of feedback, and then all of a sudden they do begin to speak, and then it's okay because everyone laughs and cheers. Well, it was like the start of that, except nobody laughed and nobody cheered. And I'd travelled down to London, 2 gigs at the Comedy Store, Saturday night, feeling good about myself, newspaper, oh yeah, oh great. And then all of a sudden, nobody laughed. And after about 5 minutes, the slow hand claps started. And the more nervous I got, the worse my delivery got, and the louder the slow hand claps got. Now, traditionally in the Comedy Store, Kim Kinney was the main booker in the Comedy Store, and he recorded every gig. He wasn't there, but he recorded it so that he could review the performance of the acts. And I knew that he would be looking at this videotape. I knew that was my Comedy Store career stone dead. I would have to get a TV deal before I get back in the Comedy Store. You can imagine how big a fall that was. This is me thinking I was beginning to get on the trajectory, and hey, a doctor in stand-up comedy. And I realised actually the stand-up comedy thing was precarious at best. And I had the opportunity of the biggest gig in my life in front of one of the most knowledgeable audiences. Sean Locke had opened. Bizarrely, Eddie Izzard had come along just to catch the vibes in the dressing room, had walked in, oh, John Paul, hi. Absolutely, but in a comedy gig, when you go through to the back dressing room and you've had a bad night, everyone avoids you. If they touch you, it's clearly infectious, whatever it is that made it bad. Nobody, no eye contact, no touch. They could learn a thing or two about communication skills, some of these guys. It was awful. So down in London for the weekend, the Sunday, I got up at 6 o'clock in the morning, walked the streets round Dave Rayside's flat. I was staying there at the time, down in Penge. Had a walk round and thought that this cannot go on. I cannot live a life where I'm at the behest of an audience of 200 or 300 people that decide this is hopeless. I cannot get back on stage again. And I flew back to Glasgow. Bizarrely, never happened to me since. On the plane, a wife of a friend was the hostess in the plane, invited me through to the cockpit, and as the plane flew into Glasgow at 8 o'clock that summer night, the sun was just beginning to come down, Glasgow bathed in sunshine, and I thought, I'm going to have a major rethink about what I do. I am never going back to this again. I'm going to have to swallow my pride and say, no more comedy, that's it, done. Of course, swallowing your pride and walking away is easier said than done. I had some gigs booked, and Harry Hill was going to do a tour around Scotland, some of the towns, and I'd booked that for a couple of weeks after, and I'd booked a run in the comedy in the Edinburgh Festival Fringe, bizarrely called the Best of Scottish Comedy, only because we had a different guest in every night who was one of the best in Scottish comedy, and myself and 2 other guys were doing this. And so I realised I had to fulfil these commitments, pared it right back, did the tour with Harry Hill, which I just managed to get through, went to the Edinburgh Festival and thought, I'm going to do this, and at the end of the Edinburgh Festival, it's a wave cheerio, and 1994 will see me stop doing comedy altogether. So I had joined up with Ford Kiernan as one of the co-presenters of the Best of Scottish Comedy in 1994. And the Edinburgh Festival, 3.5 weeks of unremitting travel through to Edinburgh, have a beer or two, have a fish supper, do the gig, travel home, and that's fine, except if you're on at 11:30 at night. So it becomes a wee bit wearing, and 4 or 5 nights in, we're travelling through with Ford Kiernan, and he said, do you remember, I'm getting a wee bit bored with this. And I said, do you know what, it's a bit tough keeping this new. He said, here's a good idea. Why don't we just split each of our sets? We'll just interdigitate. We'll both go on stage together and have a laugh and see how it goes. So it was a Wednesday night in Edinburgh in the Fringe. And if you think this room's empty, you should see how empty the rooms are in the Edinburgh Festival Fringe. This would be a heaving crowd in the Edinburgh Festival. So we travelled along, we rewrote the gig, went up on stage, and it really worked. And I think what made it work for me was I found it funny. And so determined I was that I was going to end doing comedy in mid-1994. And yet, the next 2 years saw by far and away the most productive and most fun of my comedy times. Now, some of you may know Ford Kiernan is better known as the writer and star within Still Game, him and Greg. And within that 2 years, he and I had a very good life, travelling around the country in the evenings. I was still working in the epilepsy unit, incidentally, still working with Graham Sills, pulling me to heel and making me do the science during the day. And then at nights, we would go and we'd head off to various cities in London and Edinburgh and Glasgow and all the different gigs. And we had a great time. Couple of runs in the Edinburgh Festival. And Ford, I have to say, just proof indeed that intelligence takes many. Ford is one of the quickest, sharpest minds I've ever met, and the energy he's got is just incredible. So similar to being dragged along in Graham's wake when it came to the science, Ford would drag me off, and before you know it, we'd be writing a play, we'd be doing this, we'd be doing a gig here, we'd be writing an article here, all down to Ford's energy and vision, and I was dragged along. And this went on for a few years, and by 1996, mid-1996, I'd eventually managed, just to point out the timelines here, I'd eventually managed to finish that thesis. And also the, I think, fitting end to it all, and I'll see if this works. Again, this was all down to Ford's vision and drive. He'd been having a discussion with Ken Loach, the acclaimed left firebrand film director. And he'd said he did his audition, he said, are you looking for any other parts? Are you done? He said, I'm just looking for one part. He said, I need to find someone who'll play a doctor. And Ford said, oh, I know a junior doctor with an equity card. And so this happened. Now, might take a wee bit of imagination, but if you imagine me 5 stone heavier with a head of hair, I can't watch this without cringing with embarrassment. Just to point out, now, of course, Robert Carlyle has walked in off the street as an actor, and within seconds he'll convince you that he's a Glasgow bus driver who's had a social and spiritual awakening in the Badlands of Nicaragua. I was spending my days being a junior doctor, speaking to patients and breaking bad news and giving diagnoses. And yet when the cameras turned on, I looked like anything but a guy who spent time speaking to patients and breaking bad news. And if ever there's anything that makes you realise these guys deserve every penny they get, I have to say this has come back to haunt me in so many ways, and rightly so. But the point being that by mid-1996, as I had done this is actually released the month I moved down to Liverpool, I'd managed that reverse Midas touch of taking an 18-month commitment and turning it into 5 years. This, I'm a busy man, I can't do this for very long, because things had fallen apart, because I'd had to rely on other people to build it up for me, had taken 5 years. And many people were of the opinion that spending 5 years kicking around, albeit with an MD as the result, was really a waste of my time and everybody else's. And of course, is that a waste? I would argue not, and this is what I want to talk about today, which is being at university and confusing the aim with the formal outcome. This is something we're seeing a lot in further education at the moment, this notion of the transactional element of education. If I come to your institution, I will invest my time, I will invest my money, and in return, you will give me knowledge and you will give me a degree. And universities are seen to buy into this. And we shouldn't be buying into it, and students shouldn't be buying into it either, because you will come out with a product which is much devalued. This is not a new phenomenon. John Henry Newman, now Saint Cardinal John Henry Newman, was originally an Anglican priest. And he then went over and became a Catholic and then became a cardinal, sort of Mo Johnson in reverse in theology. And he then joined the Catholic Church. He was charged with working out what universities were for. And he came out with many statements about what universities were for, really to get away from this notion that they were purely about drilling facts into individuals. That there was not quite a spiritual but a formative element to your time at university that if you don't get, you're missing out. And I like this notion. It's to prepare people of the world for the world. He actually said men of the world, but I'm not getting into that argument in 2020. And of course, this idea that universities are here just to teach facts, and at its most basic in the professional programme, we're here to teach techniques. We're here to teach terms. We're here to teach procedures. But it's got to be more than that. And we see this through other elements of education as well, because frankly, other knowledge for its own sake, other learning techniques for its own sake are as important. And every now and again, you'll get a government minister or you'll get some high-profile celebrity who usually will have had access to a broad education themselves, telling you this is nonsense. Why are we teaching these kids Anglo-Saxon? Why are we teaching them the in-depth knowledge of the Krebs cycle when actually you can go and Google it? Yeah, but the very act of learning it and recalling it is what makes university important. And that's why it's vital for people to do it. Not necessarily vital for them to do it at a young age, but it's so vital that our society puts out a high number of people with this level of education. Now, actually, the real Krebs cycle, what you want to know, my experience of the Krebs cycle, is that you learn the Krebs cycle. And then you forget the Krebs cycle. And then you relearn the Krebs cycle. And if you find it difficult, that cycle just keeps on going on and on. That's But the point here is that the act of learning and the act of relearning is vital for you to carry forward. The facts themselves don't matter. And this comes into the lecture. We have seen this happen a lot in this era of recorded lectures. We keep hearing stories of students going through a lecture forensically, 3-4 hours, copious notes, theses written on these individual lectures. That's not what the facts are a small part of the lecture. They're not the main aim of the exercise. The exercise is to sit there, listen to someone's views for an hour, distill what's important, be able to relay them, put them in context, critically appraise, and then come out with it, not to digest every single fact. The curse of ILOs has taken over education, not just in science, not just in arts, but in the medical programmes, in all the professional programmes as well. And yes, we're not sending people out with airy-fairy nonsense and some idea that it's all formative and, hey, as long as you're a good guy, it'll be okay. No. You need to learn some facts, but the facts are only a small part of what we're doing here. Education has a dual route. There's Educare, which sounds like some American consortium of boarding schools to my mind, but that means to train or to mould. And that, of course, is what people think education's about. But the other route's just as important, to bring out what's in you. Okay, now we see other disciplines, non-university disciplines, the armed forces, the other professional programmes, colleges, and where we'll train you up for jobs, and they'll very much pay attention to the educare rather than the educare. And it's about being comfortable with not being in control, because actually being comfortable with not being in control when deadlines are piling up and life's a bit tough and you're finding it a bit difficult to cope, the time to learn to do that is now. You're not here to have your hand stamped and be told how fabulous you are. That's all very well, but you're here to learn how to carry that fabulousness through in the decades to come. I would argue that actually, yes, institutions thrive when their degrees mean something. And reputations of centuries-old universities actually count for nothing if the degrees and the students don't come together and bring individuals fit for work and, more importantly, fit for life. And I think the commitment, the deadline, the tenacity, the ability to process large parts of information and critically appraise it is what we should be aiming for here. I hear this a lot, and it worries me when I hear people say, I just want to get out of here with a good degree. Just get me out of here with a commendation, my medical degree. Get me out of here with a first and I'll be fine. Actually, that ignores the reality. Because at times of bereavement, divorce, illness, unemployment, financial pressure, remembering that first you got 20 years ago is not going to cut it. having the skills brought about in how to cope with adversity and pressure and difficulty is what's going to prepare you for the vicissitudes in life later on. I want to just talk about something here. We often think the scientists and the technicians are the people who are really smart and who have a broad knowledge and everything. The more I think on this, the more I realise it's painters that are the real polymaths. When you look at painters, particularly the classical ones, the need for them to know about geometry, the need for them to know about basic anatomy, and you can see here the knowledge of neuroanatomy that's gone into Adam and the Creator in this painting in the Sistine Chapel. You can see the geometry that's needed there. They need to know the chemistry of the compounds that they're mixing. They need to know not just the skill of where to put the brush, but they need all these facts to hand. And I want to bring somebody to mind here. And Gerard Burns is probably Scotland's most famous painter at the moment, become very prolific and very high profile. My first memory of Gerard Burns was in school. He was about 2 or 3 years older than me. And I remember in primary 4 sitting in school assembly just before Christmas, and Gerard Burns took to the stage and sang Leaving on a Jet Plane by John Denver while playing the guitar. I could barely tie my laces. And I watched this man and thought, whoa, this is Renaissance man. And he was great at football, smart, singing with the guitar, absolutely a loathsome individual, okay? Exactly the kind of person you don't want to see at school. And the problem was, he was a nice guy as well. But anyway, Gerard left school and went to go to Glasgow School of Art. And he graduated, and painting was his major. And he went to be an art teacher in school. Now, Gerard's early career was architectural painting. So I've seen some of his prints, and he painted some of the buildings in Glasgow. There's a warmth, there's a delicacy about these big, imposing stone buildings. It's actually quite remarkable. And even then, you knew that this was a bit different. But you would have thought he's graduated, he's a teacher, and he's doing some paintings of buildings. That's very good. But actually, as things moved on with Gerard, he then began to show life in his pictures. Oddly, people were always facing away. And these things, and again, you can see the residue here. We've got the architectural bits in the background here. We can see the things begin to become a bit more vibrant and things move on. And then, of course, the allegorical stuff that he's become well known for, the Scotland flags, the still life, the wildlife, the nature scenes, angels, various other things that become. But actually, in the last few years, 30-odd years after coming out of Glasgow School of Art, is when he's really blossomed. And he's now become a portrait painter of actually greatness. Now, you cannot be anyone in Scotland, it would appear, without having been painted by Gerard Burns. And there is barely anyone. And there's something about these paintings, not just the ability to convey a face, but the humanity and the statement in these. The one on the top right here is his own father holding a picture of his father. And I find that incredibly moving. Why am I talking about this just now? Well, actually, facial recognition is really odd, really weird. If you put white male blonde hair in, these are the faces that come up in Google Images. And actually, you know that none of these is him. You can tell that right away. There's only one Boris Johnson in there. Even his brother, you can tell it's not him. You have the ability to look at those features and know that that's one individual. You know that all of those are 5 different individuals. Sometimes some opinions and some attitudes in common that we'd rather not have. But, bizarrely, it's not just that. No matter the mood, no matter the age, you know that all of these are the same person. You can be quite clear that this, and the ability to look at the complexity here, sift out minor differences, and yet at the same time cling on to things that are similar and work out exactly who's who, clearly is a big evolutionary advantage, telling friend from enemy, family from stranger. But the complexity in this is enormous. So sensitive and specific is this, that actually caricaturists can can exaggerate many of these features, and you will still know that 2 of these are the same person as Boris Johnson in the photo, and one of them, although if you were to describe literally what was there, one of them is somebody else completely. And how can we do this? And facial recognition software is remarkable. And the mathematical parallels of all these distances that you see here between the nose and the iris and the epicanthic folds and the chin and the nasal cleft and all these things, really important. But it's really, there's more than that going on in the brain. Picasso. Everyone thinks that Picasso was this surrealist. This is one of Picasso's earlier works. This is him at an early stage in his career. And yet, what's he well known for? Taking you back to the neuroscience, you know that these are faces. These are hugely mutated, and yet there's something in the human psyche, something that's made these universally successful. Not only can you tell that they're faces, but you can infer the mood. You can infer the weeping and the crying from this. And yet, there is no way on earth that any computer would look at this and recognise it as a face. So the facial recognition of neuroscience is so delicately wired, so important, so intrinsic in what we do. And of course we see it here. This is you looking at the brain from below. Okay? For any of the clinical students, if a patient comes to you in this state, they're in big trouble. Okay? So you're looking at the brain from below. That's the right side and that's the left. And this is the temporal lobes you're looking at here, the parahippocampal gyrus, and this thing here is said to be spindle-shaped, hence the name, fusiform gyrus, is where the brain, the evolution has decided that your facial recognition should live. Now, I've given a wee bit of a diagram here because there's a specific thing. Bizarrely, you've got your dominant hemisphere, which controls your speech, and the arm and hand and foot that you're most comfortable using. And usually, in most people, no matter what side their dominant hemisphere's in, the fusiform face area is always on the right-hand side. This is something that nature has decided is so important, despite the complexity, that it's always got to be in the same place. This will not be tricked, which tells me that when someone can take pigments and brushes and canvas and remove that from the person and show you not just who it is, but what mood they're in at the time, that's something truly special. And if you can paint a portrait and have their immediate family members know exactly who it is and what kind of mood they're in, you've done something truly special. You truly are a polymath. Why am I bringing this up? Because when Gerard Burns came out of university, there's no way he would have produced those pictures. The graduation was just the start. The graduation was the foundation. It wasn't even the end of the beginning of the beginning. It was just the very basic tools of what he was going to become. And history is littered with people who've taken an education, used the skills within that education, but not necessarily the facts. Whether it's Einstein, whether it's Churchill from his time at Sandhurst, Churchill's success was not based on what he learned at Sandhurst. It was based on how he was and how he got through Sandhurst and took things on from there. J.K. Rowling studied French and classics at Exeter University. That in no way prepared her, although you could argue some of the spells derived from her knowledge of classics, but in no way prepared her for the global multi-billion-pound success of her novels. So the big question here, of course, is why I, to some eyes, a failed comedian, bothered with comedy? Well, actually, there were things I learnt there. The amount of time that I took through that failure of a 5-year MD actually taught me a lot about relying on other people and resilience and coming back from failure, both professional, personal, scientific. Those 5 years were absolutely formative, and working with the teams, whether that's Graham Sills or whether it's Ford Kiernan, actually brought things on and made me realise exactly how much we realise in other people. And why would I bother with comedy? For exactly the same reason that you should be bothering with your writing, or with your pottery, or with your bassoon, or your harpsichord, or whatever it is you want to do. These are vital things that you need to carry with you, not dispose of, all in the name of learning the Krebs cycle a bit better, but actually carry with you and take on. One of the big things we've tried to do in the medical school in the last few years, and this is after decades of letting this go to rack and ruin, is bring back the Wednesday afternoons. Wednesday afternoons are for things other than formal medical training and medical teaching. There will be times where you'll need to do that because some things are only on a Wednesday afternoon. But most of the time, you should be preparing yourself for the work-life balance that you're going to need when you're in your 40s and your 50s and your 60s and beyond. And you get into that habit before you graduate, you're much more likely to take it with you afterwards and on into your development of a career. Being focused is all very well. I happened to listen to this podcast earlier this week. My son's big on listening to these podcasts, and Joe said to me, you've got to listen to this, absolutely revolutionary. And Jonny Wilkinson talks about his rugby career and how all through his early to mid-career, all he could think about was playing rugby, getting on the pitch, doing what he was supposed to do to the best he could so that he could be the Jonny Wilkinson he wanted to be. And of course, the crisis of confidence, despite the global success, the World Cup winning kick in 2003 did not leave him happy and content. That would be his equivalent of the first class degree. Just get me out of here having kicked a World Cup winning kick. No. He began to realise midway to late through his career that there was more to it than that. And having fought injury and disillusionment and mental health, actually, he had to be happy to be who he was going to be, and being happy made him better at what he wanted to do in the first place. Focusing in and practicing 10 times more kicks was just making him miserable. Getting back to realising what it is he enjoyed about rugby and the passion about that and the way that then translated to winning made him happy. It wasn't the happiness. It wasn't the winning that made him happy. It was the process to get there. And as he said, if you could take the experience of missing a 20-yard kick and accept that with as much joy and as much learning as you could making the 50-yard kick from the sidelines, then you've won. Then you've brought your own passion to the game and you've made sure that you're going to succeed. I think there are lessons in life that I've learned along the way. I think some of them are obvious. I think one of the main ones here is the bottom one. You're not in control. And I think we've seen that over the last 9 months. No one's been in control in the last 9 months. So we have to accept this comfort with not being in control and affecting what you can affect and making of it what you can. Because no one's going to guarantee a way out of this. But you can guarantee your way, you can form your response to circumstances over the next year and a half. So what are universities for? Going back to John Newman's point. And I know you'll have seen this phrase, Glasgow's a world-changing university. Well, it should be life-changing for you, and as a cohort, it should be making you world-changing. And I would like to think the University of Glasgow and other institutions who for centuries have been trying to build up graduates, build up undergraduates, turn them into graduates, and bring them back into the fold, hopefully, as future teachers, like to think they're going to be changing the world one graduate at a time. So you need to make the most of what you can do for yourself, knowing full well that's what makes the world change eventually, bit by bit.